and the HDR. All good? Oh, there it is. I see. And I'm unmuted. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space, especially if you're just arriving now. Thank you for joining us for the next installment in the Thinking Aloud series, Social Justice, Migration, and the Environment. Of course, to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube Live from Fourth Space, but we are located at unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And here we work with the university community to create events daily that help mobilize knowledge, examine the current research questions and projects happening here at Concordia. And today we're running this event as a live streamed Zoom meeting, and that means that guests on Zoom are more than welcome to ask comments or questions via the chat. And for you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know, raise your hand, and we'll get one of our microphones over to you. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to our moderator for this afternoon, Gary Sangster. Gary.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that introduction greatly. I'm very pleased to be here at Concordia University to participate in this session around documentation. I'd like to thank the people at Fourth Space for their technical brilliance. That's the first thing. I'd like to thank Leela and her entire team for putting together this particular colloquium and for establishing some ground rules with regard to how the research of this project, Thinking Aloud, might be disseminated effectively. And I'd like to thank the panelists that we have today who are going to present and assist us in the discussion. So, Thinking Aloud, social justice, migration, and the environment. Let me say from the outset that that's a very daunting set of issues to be dealing with through this research project. It's wide-ranging, it's ambitious, the scope is very intimidating. And so thinking about how we might document that is the point of this particular workshop. It's a working dialogue, so it's not a Q&A. We're not here to answer your questions per se. We're here to facilitate discussion and to accept your ideas and try and integrate those into the documentation process that we are pursuing in order to disseminate the research that's been undertaken through this particular project. So the goals of today's session are discussing and defining channels for communication, distribution, and also importantly for archive purposes. So I'd like to introduce the speakers located in London today who will speak directly through the Zoom process is Roshini Kempadu. She's the Center for Research and Education in the Arts and Media, PhD Program Director at the University of Westminster. She's also a photographer and media artist who interprets, analyzes, and reimagines historical experiences and memories as women's visual narratives within the focus of migration.
Hi, can everybody see me? Hi, thanks very much, Gary, for introducing me. Just going to share my my screen. If you can stop sharing yours, that would be great. Thank you. Great. Can everybody see that? I hope so. Thanks to everybody for coming, and I just want to, in this short period of time, is to contribute some thinking around how I've been tackling and wrangling with documentation of work that looks at that is in multiple forms and in multiple formats. And so I also wanted to just pose some of the solutions that I kind of have come up with over a very long period of time. But primarily I work in photography, but moved towards the digital. So you can see my montage here. I've worked very much with a kind of a Photoshop since it was invented, and thinking about the limits of the photograph, of the documentary image, and moving towards using new technology towards trying to engage in different ways to provide a more a wider and more complex idea of a lived experience and its relationship to the past, in relation to colonialism, in relation to the Caribbean, and as Gary mentioned, in relation to particularly women's lived experiences as well. So it has been very, very interesting. And so working with the archives has been a key kind of framing of mine. But I guess in some ways, what I end up doing with this work is thinking about iterations of it, if you like, and some of the ways in which I've done that. As I move towards more interactive screen-based environments, is to still work with the photographic and the still image in order to think through documentation and in order to have as complementary series, if you like. So these are some of the images that emerge that are part of Ghosting, which is a piece I produced in 2004. And the images, the still images that emerged from this piece of work actually have had a life of their own and continued on in various publications, in Fragments of Epic Memory, for example, in the show at AGO in Toronto. So it's an output of a form and an iteration of ghosting, if you like, that I actually have worked towards in terms of it having an afterlife. Again, here, Sunil curated a series for the Photographic Biennale as well. But I just wanted to kind of give you an indication of what it originally started out at, which was it was a interactive piece, and it was an interactive piece that was shown in 3 or 4 different locations using Director as a technology and working with the on-off buttons. You can see there is a kind of a derived Warai board that I used with stones that people can then move and trigger, if you like, different stories. So it's already kind of a more interactive piece that I originally conceived, still working with the still image, and if you like, thinking through the idea of the still moving image, if you like. And this also had an audio component to it, of course, which accompanied the stories in the gallery space. And you can see how this works in the gallery space. And people, of course, are very interested in moving those stones. It's the tactility of the stones that meant that people were very happy to kind of keep on moving them and seeing. And so I see the technology in this sense as a prosthetic, if you like, that actually kind of more immerses the person in the stories, but also can try and problematize the idea of hierarchy of stories, if you like. So we hear from 3 or 6 different voices in relation to this piece, and depending on where you move the stones from, and it was very well received in that sense. Of course, documenting it has been a very interesting and difficult process. Needless to say that the versioning, as everybody knows, means that the thing often becomes redundant. And this has happened time and time again as I've moved through working on CD-ROMs, working with websites, archiving websites, etc. So, so for me, the documentation, if you like, has never really fully encompassed and engaged with ghosting as it was originally conceived. And I just wanted to also bring like Gold Dust, which was a piece I have produced for San Antonio at Art Pace in 2019. And again, this was then reproduced as a document in the catalogue, of course, that was accompanied at Art Pace. And these are some of the images as still images that are an element of the installation piece. Again, it was fictionalizing stories and reimagining a lived experience of the woman environmental activist. And it was situated in Texas. The imagined stories were coming out of my research in Texas and my trip to Guyana, and particularly Essequibo, which is an area where the oil has been discovered offshore, and where the First Nations, or Amerindians as we call them in Guyana, are actually living and own the land. So this was work that was coming from that. So I worked again with kind of montaging images and thinking about how to kind of source archive footage, the conjuring of the oil baron, if you like, but also to think through what the oil companies were producing as visual material. Again, using a split screen and montage material. So these again are some of the photographs. And again, they have their longevity. So they were then in various shows, in photographic shows, and documented and published as well. But I also, for example, worked with a poem that was I was given permission to use by Sarah Little Crow Russell around ghost dancing. So it was a complementary set of materials that were in the gallery space as an installation. So as you can see, these pieces were framed, the images were framed in the space. And this was what it looked like as a whole in the gallery space, with most of the images on show. And again, there was also a silent video that was then also I produced for it. And it is this video that I'm taking forward into my next project, which I'm contributing to the Elastic Spaces, which is thinking about another iteration, if you like, emerging from this kind of space of Guyana and the relationship to extraction, if you like, of oil and fossil fuels. So I just wanted to quickly play you. Do I have time, Gary, to just play this silent movie?
Yes, how long?
1 minute and something.
Perfect.
Yep. Okay. So you can just get a sense of it. Okay. So I'll stop sharing, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention, really, as a kind of a video, how to think about the way in which I might document that. So in terms of I just wanted to close by talking about some solutions in terms of how I've thought through really the longevity and the archiving process of my work. One of them has been to use my research process and uncovering my research process through talking about artistic methodology. And that's been published in various magazines and journals. And it's a way of really understanding and excavating, if you like, just the decision-making process of that work. So that's been about writing and using illustrations in academic journals to uncover artistic methodology, if you like. And so having discussions, for example, around the technological advantages of and limitations of working with new technology in relation to race, racism, colonialism, for example. And then, of course, that also is contributions that I've made through conferences, etc. But I guess the other thing I also would think about would be the REF portfolios that we put together as part of the REF is a research framework that we have in the UK, where we put together portfolios which actually really took documentation, if you like, and made them as part of that process of talking about the project, which I feel is a really interesting way of uncovering design decisions, uncovering aesthetic developments and technological developments as well. And I guess the other way I would think about solutions would be have been through web-rich environments of where of a website or a presence that actually can capture all of those elements of the audio, of the moving image, and of the writing in a way that then can be animated and worked through in workshops, etc. So I guess that's my contribution. I'm hoping I kept to time, but it would be nice to have a discussion to see what other people have had as experiences in terms of working with multiple formats and how to think about their future legacy, if you like, and circulation. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Roshini. We really appreciate that. We'll have a chance to discuss with Roshini her ideas later on in the session. I'd like to now introduce Sabina Gomez Ibarra, is a Colombian audiovisual artist. Currently, she's pursuing her MFA in Intermedia and is a research assistant at Elastic Spaces Lab at Concordia University. So, Sabina.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to also thank Elastic Spaces and all the team for the hard work and also congratulate everyone for these big accomplishments. So just gonna share my screen. That's working. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So yes, I'm an audiovisual artist from Colombia, and currently I'm a second-year MFA Intermedia student. So in my practice, I work with the body and its relation to space. So I experiment with different formats and approaches to audiovisual media, including photography, chroma key, projection, VR, video installation, and video performance to explore notions of the self, self-recognition, and remnants and embodiment in the media. Since I started my MFA, my practice has been oriented to the understanding of the physical and phenomenological experience of embodiment and the way in which it's understood in and contextualized also in media and in the environment. So today I'm going to talk about a summer collaboration named Sabinar. So while I'm talking, this video is going to be playing. Just give me a second. Okay. So this summer collaboration, I collaborate with the print artist Sabina Rag, and we created the multimedia installation Sabinar. So our project takes many shapes, from green screen, video art to digital and video collage, print and media, audio pieces, sculpture, typesetting, and mail art. It developed through a chance of meeting and common obsession with the theme of the rape of the Sabine woman throughout our history and mythology. So the exploration of this theme has led us in various directions. So passing from feminist art, ecological considerations, and questions of what it means to have and to create community, all related to our explorations of materials that range from virtual realm to the raw matter of the earth. So our interest is first of exploration, which individually has been obsessed with the Jacques-Louis David painting El Rapto de las Sabinas. But it was not until we got together and we evaluate and kind of consider that this was actually the only version where the Sabinas are taking a stand, fighting, taking control in the battle. So conquest, abduction, and colonization are violent terms that are tied to Sabina's history. But we're not making art about what happened in BC. We are taking in a myth that has persisted in art, and we're embodying in the history, in the now. We question who is writing the story, and we put in our bodies within the piece. So we're trying to read between the perpetuated images. Our piece has different shades of humor and layers, and many attempts to understand one's place. And we intervene in the myth, we decontextualize it and recontextualize it. And to ensure this piece in a mix of meanings, overlaps, questions, and physical and historical space. So this video specifically is about collaging, mixing Sabinas, coexisting, crossing generations, constraint movement, repetition, heritage, and translation, and a still image with a series of doom-looped images of ourselves. We took the painting to be our theater background, to play in, so play and game came before meaning as a modus operandi of our conversations. And in play one's also straight social bonds. And the sound is a bit loud. Maybe. And we were trying different things. We were exploring, laughing. There were moments of doubt, but we mainly kept this idea of collaborating and finding a way to understand each other's images. And maybe all of this is about is Sabinar, which is the term that we came up with for this name. And it's finding one's peoples across frontiers and creating communities. So each place within the exhibition each piece within the exhibition has a different name that comes together after a game of words, poems, and change of meaning. So this particular video, it's holding energy, playing with fire, glorifying and destroying and birthing at once. So this piece touches on several ecological issues surrounding fire, the destruction of nature, the human versus its actions. And we talk here about ecofeminism and the current climate change crisis, ancient practices of witches, and the overall idea of knowledge transmission through the work of women. And okay, so this print that you see big in the wall there, we call it Las Sabinas, is another way of positioning ourselves in the history. We're going back to the myth and thinking about who is writing the history, having a conversation with the imagery and playing with different ways of portraying and thinking about representation and repetition as well. And so cardstock, envelopes, typesetting, handwriting poems in Spanish, English, and French. And so this artist statement is a correspondence between two Sabinas, writing, merging images, words, meaning, and languages. This piece stands as the synthesis of the concept of the whole undertaking of our project. And the poems included our reflections on what is a Sabina across time, space, art, and community, but also coming back to embodying like the story in our hands, also like giving the word to the Sabina and to women in general. So as we say in Colombia, las palabras tienen poder and words are powerful. So our name is full of history, violence, but we want to decontextualize it, merge it, and we question it, created a new meaning, a different past written by women. We also did this exploration of clay that was actually really interesting because it was our first approach to this medium for both of us. But it just makes sense that that was the way we kind of like came back together, in the sense that we shaped the words and we shaped the meaning and we both united, created these shapes. The one that is broken was meant to be the tongue, and of course the tongue was broken. It has to be that way. It happened as a chance, but it couldn't be more perfect in that way. And right before it was broken, above its translation, which is just a beautiful chance. So clay, ink, word transfer, glaze. So we're playing with traces of human, the museum displays and archaeological archives, thinking about ancestors, but we're mixing the present with the past and we rearranging the words making a new language with our hands. So this piece is a mix of recorded conversations between us, the vocabulary we built together across our 4 languages to find a common ground. So we're speaking in the same issues across nationalities and generations and history. And I wanted to finish this presentation of Las Sabinas with a fragment of Charlotte Jansen as part of the publication, Why Rape of the Sabine Women Made Me a Feminist. So I'm gonna read what she wrote. This crime against the Sabine women, raped or stolen, they were forcibly removed from their community and into marriages with Romans, has been depicted by many artists throughout history, from Degas to Poussin to Picasso. Why is this scene of mass abuse so celebrated? The beautification of sexual violence is unacceptable, but is hardly rare in art. What I want to think when I look at them is the need to resist, to fight, to struggle, and to never forget our truth. The title of the work, after all, is The Sabine Woman, not the Romans. So we took this specific reading because it made really sense of what we're trying to do. So we want to give back the voice to the women and create community, getting together to define new words and meaning and reshape our history, but always in a playful way, challenging also the way it is written. There's no other powerful tool than humor, and that's what we're appealing for, and like taking this serious task in a way that we can reframe it and reshape it so it's re-understood. I think I made up that word, sorry. So I bring this project in the context of Thinking Aloud and this panel for the way we embody our research and our name in our artwork. So our goal is to create together in community, thinking outside frontiers, borders, and languages. So also as a research assistant from Elastic Spaces, being part of building the Thinking Aloud, like allow me to bring back this idea of bringing together a diverse range of voices from different fields, that it actually makes a difference. And I truly believe that we're stronger together. So we should open more spaces that allow us to care and to think about creation in disciplinary practices, and where art and science, education, history, and politics join forces and questions like path of society is taken, and thinking about community building. And yes, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sabina. I'd like to introduce our third speaker. Originally from Hong Kong, Hai Lam Ying is a Canadian-based artist currently residing in Montreal, Quebec. Her works cross disciplines in print media, photography, books, objects, and text art. Hai Lam?
I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you, Gary, and thank you everyone for being here. Okay, great. This is my long artist statement. You don't have to read the whole thing. I've highlighted the key points. So yes, I do work in lots of different areas, and I consider myself as a project-based artist. So each project consists of different format or material or theme, but the common ideas and concepts that I explore are pretty similar and consistent. They're often related to languages, displacements, abstract spaces, accessibility, and translation. And I have been creating work that what I call they introduce an active perception is a new term that I'm trying to use, which by that I mean my work you're supposed to see in person to fully experience it. So the photos that you're gonna see soon might not deliver the whole experience, but you get the idea of it. So because it's project-based, so the subject matter often determines the material and the presentation of my project. So I'm going to present some of my MFA research work. I work with text a lot, even before I began the MFA program. But in the past, I mostly used text as description to my photo-based work, or as creative writing, like writing poetry. Since I began the MFA project, I I have been moving on, progressing in my practice, and I'm still kind of in the stage of changing. So I'm not entirely sure where I'm heading to. I'm in the stage of like progressing and I can take different paths. The work I'm going to show, they take very direction of using text. This one particularly was inspired from a conversation I had with a visually impaired artist years ago. And I wanted to write description, like alt text description for my photo-based work, but then I realized it's too overwhelming if I'm trying to just literally describe every element in the photograph. So I adapted a more creative way to, instead of describing what exactly is in the photograph, I am suggesting a narration. So there are 20 panels in total. There are like 2 panels a set. On the left is the description of the narration that I am, of the narration I'm suggesting, and then is transcribed into Braille and laser engraved onto the panel on top of the digital printout text. And then the second panel on the right is the outline shape of the object or subject that is being suggested in the text. So the decision of doing it this way is that so it doesn't matter of the viewer's ability to see or not. The narration is always based in their imagination. So they can choose to read the work or touch the Braille, and they can choose to see the shape or touch the shape themselves. And the narration is always somehow different and unique to the person instead of a regular photograph that might have limited accessibility. And then I have moved on to treating text or language as object. This project is called Jabberwocky's Japanese interpretation based on the Jabberwocky poem from Alice in Wonderland. That poem in the novel is a nonsense poem, is the origin of gibberish language. So the poem itself doesn't make sense, and not to mention the Japanese interpretation to like a very minor, for a very minor group of audience. The idea of this project is not to try to understand the text, but to try to read text or language as an object. So in the story, this poem was actually mirror. Alice wasn't able to read the text until she accidentally discovered the text was mirror through looking through a mirror reflection that she can see the text. But however, the text itself doesn't make sense. So you're able to see, let's say, the alphabet, but they do not construct a literal meaning to you. And that is the experience I was trying to recreate in this piece. I did install the reflective mirror to reflect the back of each letter card. That was the original poem. And then on the front side is the Japanese interpretation with the Japanese alphabet. So none of it makes sense. The poem itself doesn't make sense. The interpretation doesn't make sense, but it's more about the idea of trying to understand and trying to read them and then realize that you still don't understand them. And then I have then moved on to using letters, language as images instead of trying to compose literal meaning. This is an artist book I complete called Every Single Type. And it's very straightforward. I print every single type letter from a type case. This is printed with letterpress. So traditionally speaking, letterpress, we have cases, which is a very big drawer, consists of all the letter types. I pick one drawer from print media, and then I print every single of them. And this is the cover of the book, which is every single type in the picture, and is designed to represent this layout of the physical case, the drawer. And the inside of the pages, rather than composing a meaning from all the letters, I am just arrange them in shapes, composition, trying to play with the arrangement instead of giving meaning to a certain words or phrase. I keep them very open-ended and loose. I don't want to imply too much. I want to leave space for my viewer to interpret. And when I showed this work to my colleague, I was happy that it was received very differently per person. And that's exactly the goal of it. Another side note is that this project is 80% of the material I use, including creating the accessories to use in the printing process. They're upcycle material. And the concept is that by just seeing the type themselves, I think they are already a piece of artwork to me that I don't have to do too much. I should just let them speak for themselves. So I don't think I need to use like very artsy, fancy material. I just get upcycled material from the reusable center. And all I want to focus on is to just create an imprint of the physical object that I appreciate a lot. And then there's more in progress project. After using text as image, I head into a little new direction of defining meaning for words. These are gibberish words that I just generate from a generator online. They are fake words, they have no meaning. And I just ask the audience and the participants to define them. So I asked the audience to give meaning to these fake words, and so far it has been a really good experience. I have did the the participatorial writing twice, and they're in different format. The first time I did that as business cards, so the words is on the front and then the definition is on the back. The second time I did them in little paper strips that you can see the writing and the definition at the same time. And for both of the times that I've done it, I display them in a way that they're welcome to write new definition, but they can also read the predefined definition from others. And I really enjoy seeing the audience engaging and they're learning from what they're seeing, and they get inspired, and you get this zestify kind of look on them. They feel like they have accomplished something, and because they're fake words, so they don't have the burden of needing to properly or correctly define or write something. They can just have the freedom to compose however they want. Some people do choose to use visual language. So instead of writing a definition, is a drawing, which I appreciate a lot. And then kind of like moving to another off branch, I started to create objects that represent language and text instead of actually having text on them. So these are laser cut acrylic type pieces. They fit on the letterpress. They're this like I try to design them to be printable on the letterpress, but there's a little bit of technical issue. They're not that even, so they're not actually printable with ink, but I get a really nice embossment with them. So these are the objects that remind us for language and text, but they do not actually have any language and text on them. I see them more like an object, individual pieces of small sculpture. The print on the side just to show you what it would look like. But I do see the pieces themselves as the base of the artwork. The print is more like a side product of it. And then this piece is freestanding embroidery text. I have been thinking of how we use text. They're always on a surface, like writing, we write on a piece of paper. And I was trying to think of if they can exist in a different dimension or exist on their own. So these are freestanding embroidery. They're not attached to anything per se. They're floating in the air. So they're not on any surface, and they're the surface themselves. This was the concept that I wanted to explore. I am just getting into textiles, so there is a lot still to learn, but from this test I made, I think the idea is being conveyed that they are freestanding, they're not attached to anything specifically. And depending how I install them, they could be against a surface, but still not like fully embedded into it, or they can just be suspended in the middle of the room. And this is a further development from the embroidery idea. I wanted to create a lot of text using the freestanding embroidery and try to project them cast shadows of the text. However, that was a little beyond my skills and budget at the time. So I substituted the embroidery with paper scrap. These were paper scrap made with cotton rag paper offcuts from the print media studio. And I repurposed them into pulp, and then I turned them into organic shapes of paper. And the idea of this work is to cast shadow from various shapes to recreate a feeling of underneath a leafy tree. So I was trying to get this specific piece, I was trying to get leaf shades, but for the actual piece I was hoping to create with the freestanding embroidery is you would get shadows of the letters, and they're all overlapping, and you would not be able to see the letter per se, but you would see the negative space of letters. But this was the idea of it. Oops. And I would also like to mention and show some of the paper sample that I have been working on for specific, more related to the Thinking Aloud project. One of the booklet with about the deforestation with the elder Bill Jones. This is not per se my practice, but I do happen to be also researching about paper making, and I was happy to have the chance to kind of experiment with these salal and cedar leaves shipped here from BC. Just quickly gonna go through the process, and then after the talk, I will welcome you to come actually see the physical paper sample that is on the table. So we got the dry leaves from BC, we got a few shipment, and we dehydrate them further to prevent molding. And then I cook them to remove the pigment before mixing them into the pulp. And then this pulp is also made with the recycled cotton rag paper scrap. So we're not using a part of a tree per se to create our booklet. That's what's the idea of the booklet. And then these cedar bits are mixing with the pulp to form a sheet of paper. And then I place the salal leaf on top. And then I will sandwich them together just so that the salal leaf wouldn't fall off the paper. Yeah, you can hold it. I didn't have a lot of picture of the dry one because I just gave them to Leela. So you're welcome to come see the paper later. But that is the research I was doing this summer. And I welcome you to take a look at the actual paper later. And that's it for my presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Helen. We've used up about an hour and a bit of our time, and that means that we have the opportunity now to open up to the floor and to anyone on Zoom to engage in questions. I guess, first of all, I'd like to ask if there are any specific questions for the three presenters. The purpose of the artistic presentations today by the artist researchers was to provide I think a small creative research kind of practice or framework in which to help us situate the possibility of thinking about what documentation of these ranges of practices could be like. So first of all, I'd ask if anyone has specific questions of Roshini, Sabina, or Hailem. No? That's fine. The next phase of the project. Yes, please.
Yeah, I could ask something for the last presenter, Hainan. Thank you. Thank you everyone for the presentations. I think I have a question for you about language as estrangement and language and its relation to decoloniality and your playful, critical detours and expansiveness of like the letters as materiality, all these strategies. And I know that for myself, when I'm thinking of strategies of decoloniality in practice, I think of ways to expand identity and to set identity into relation. And I cannot help but I'm just wondering how you think about the strategies of protests that the young people in Hong Kong affected with the the signs with no language on it that happened, and the beautiful kind of unknownness of what that could mean and how they could feel. And I just, if you had a connection to that or you don't, this work is about the medium of the print set and the way the relationships with written language and material language and spoken language. I just thought it's not really a question, it's kind of these detours around this distancing and approach that you have.
Thank you. I don't think in my artwork I actively think about using language as a tool for decolonization, but I'm aware that's when I feel about displacement. I'm from Hong Kong, so my first language is Cantonese, but then I was born in the British era, so my second language is British English, which is very different when I moved here. And then when I was living in Vancouver for the past 14 years, I also learned Mandarin and Japanese. So I guess the more language I learn or use, and they were further away from my first language, I feel the displacement. I feel like I lose the identity of where I originally came from. But one thing very special about language is that you will never fully lose it. You will forget most of it, but you cannot fully lose it, in my own opinion. So when the protests were happening in Hong Kong, I think beside the blank slogan, I think that was actually more prominent or a stronger statement in China, because the censorship there is a lot more strict. In Hong Kong, the protester actually developed slightly different language to exchange messages and without being tracked by the officials. In Hong Kong, we have this very unofficially way of spelling the pronunciation of Cantonese characters, which is everyone do it differently. So like my name, Hey Lam, the way it spells it, it was just trying to mimic the sound of my actual Cantonese name, but it has no meaning in English. So this is kind of like a similar way that the protesters were using when they were texting or writing slogans. They were writing in this very unofficial, slangy kind of like, it's more like a British-based way of trying to recreate a Cantonese sound. And because this has more English involved in it, the official, or especially if they're a Mandarin speaker, they're not able to decode it. So that was the way that specifically these protesters in Hong Kong were communicating. Yeah, that's like a sample that I wanted to give you. But thank you for mentioning that.
Can I just add or ask some questions, really? Some great presentations, and thank you. I'll just pitch in. I just following on from the contribution in the audience, which was really interesting to pick up on Hai Lam's work. Because of course, one of the things about justice and migration and environment is how powerful language and hybrid language could be kind of used as a tool of resistance, etc. So I'm really kind of very interested. What I'm trying to do is to kind of make connections to thinking out aloud, right? The idea of how we're thinking about art in relation to social justice, migration, and the environment. And I was really struck by the kind of the origin stories that you are both using in order, or origin objects or histories or myths, if you like, that you are using to kind of work from. And I wondered if you can both say a little more about it. I mean, my own thinking around migrations and social justice and decolonizing at the moment is thinking through the opportunity of understanding a non-European centered space, right? And I just wondered, I was struck by both of you coming and orientating us through a history of Western art or through a history of mythology of fairy tales. And I just wondered if you could respond to that in relation to our theme this evening.
I think I can start. Right, so for us, Sabina, that she's also here in the audience, the other Sabina, hi Sabina. It's really interesting because our first connection was through this painting and of course through the name. And so we were like, oh, there's no many people with our name. This is odd, let's take a picture together. And then we sit and we talk about how obsessed we were with this history and how strong it is in the sense of like mistranslation and this idea of like the language being removed and like the violence being removed from that history again and again through art and also through the story. And the fact that we were both not from Canada and together we have this mixture of languages and trying to find a meaning together was really important. So I think we found a community within the language and the possibility of creating a different type of connection to our language that was not precisely divided by frontiers or like, oh, you come from, like I come from Colombia and we have like this specific, but we rather think about language as a way of liberating like ourselves and this history and like reshaping it and playing with it in so many ways and doing so many collages with meaning, but also with images and superposition. So by doing these layers, we're questioning who's writing the history from both places that we are coming from. History has always been told by the winners, which is not us. And of course, the colonizers. And so we also thinking about like, if we come together with these words, what would it be? What can we do to create and to change these violent settings that comes together with our name, but also to think about it and hasten them as well, of just like phrasing them, putting it in everyone's face and being like, why is this okay, right? But of course, through humor and like through these different layers that perhaps people are more approachable to. So I think that through language, we created these connections and also that go towards these specific practices, like creating clay, but also having it displayed next to these videos with chroma key and with all like technologies. We're also just talking about like how we can find a way to get everything united. It doesn't have to be just, oh, this is like archival and this is different and it has to be treated in a different way, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
I don't think my practice is as much art history reference than Sabina's. I think for
I guess
me,
in the mythology, I was thinking about the fairy tale.
Yeah, so I think for me is the space that I always leave to my audience to perceive my work. I like, for example, when I ask them to define gibberish, there's no guideline except I ask them to be respectful, not to be hateful, but they can define it the way they want, and the way I did with the invisible type and the book with the every single type. I'm not actually actively trying to imply or give them any meaning. Rather, I'm more curious on the other side. I want to observe how they perceive it, and then maybe they are creating their meaning, and I would like to engage with that more rather than me telling them this is an apple and then this is forever an apple. I guess for me, I'm more interested in the ambiguous side of language. Like, we can be very specific with language, but on the other side, we can be very loose about it. And then I think there's a beauty in the loose part. And particularly for me is because of the multiple languages I speak, I often are fascinated by the lost in translation gap. there are just so many words and description and feeling and tradition and culture that is embedded in one language and is not fully translated or accessible to an outsider or to a person who cannot access to language. And for me, that is a very beautiful part of languages, text, but it's not fully accessible. So I do have other projects that I will say specifically looking in this, but overall, I would say I enjoy these kind of vague, loose spaces for people to interpret. I
Sure,
hope
that
that-
comes
I hope
across.
that
Thank you.
answered.
Thank you.
I think there was another question in the public.
Hey, hi. My question is for Sabina. I was especially struck by your use of fire in your art, and we know that it has both destructive connotations and regenerative connotations, and also it made me think of the Pompeii disaster in Rome. What can you say about that?
Thank you for the question. I think we wanted to bring everything on fire. And I think while I'm talking, I'm gonna put the background just because it's fun. But give me a second. But basically, this idea of we wanted to relate. So we wear these togas and that we made them with like bed sheets and like it was really DIY. And when we were recording these, we actually didn't knew what we were going to do about it. At the beginning, it was going to be part of the Sabine, the rape of the Sabine women, the first painting that I show. But then the more we talk about like these translations and these ideas of coming together and thinking about the past, we kept thinking about fire and how fire also transformates. Yeah, sorry. So we thought that it just made sense to think about this born in history, because of course, every abduction, colonization, and act of war and violence, it's within fire and destruction, as we're seeing it there in the map. So we did also really important part was having archival fire. So for example, this from documentaries and like from places like that are talking about the big fire that happened in the Roman Empire and how that was actually created by one of the like legislators at that moment, and holding that fire for us was really important. So we were holding nothing, but at the same time, we're holding fire and this idea of transformation and the possibility of, so that's what fire meant for us. Like it's a transformation, like what could it be, right? So like from the ashes and from thinking about, oh, that was weird. So coming, like thinking, of course, the empire fell down and we're celebrating it kind of too. We are putting it behind us, putting this really typical pose of the art world, like celebrating is burning down, but also going back to like women and witch practices where like were women around the fire, sharing knowledge, sharing like nature also, like how to read through it. So I think our relation with fire is towards that as well. And just to make a point, and yeah, this possibility of transformation, I think is the most important thing that I repeated like 3 times. But I do, because that's also what language does. And like in our pieces, we put names in Spanish, English, and French, and then we swiped them towards all the piece. So everything has the same name and not name at the same time, which is also this idea of holding fire that you can't without being burned. So I think that's our relation to the fire. But thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more question focused on the artwork, or because I'd like to move on to some discussion about specific questions of documentation. So if we can just briefly.
I was very interested in what Sabina said about delivering what you're trying to talk about through humor. And I maybe it's because of that, I saw the diagrams that Rashina used in her video of the extraction almost as funny too. They become quite cartoonish. And I wonder if maybe the three artists could talk a little bit about using humor or even juxtaposing things that seem very contradictory, and how that helps to make your work a little bit more playful.
Yeah, I thank you for your question. I think that for us, I mean, humor historically has been a way to saying the truth without getting killed, basically. So I don't know the word for that in English. Arlequines is the word we use for like that entertained the king or the queen. And we're saying the truth towards these funny rhymes, but that they were criticizing the regime. So I think in our piece, it's important to always play with this idea, because also in the painting of the Sabine woman, we're taking this serious pose, but then we're switching back to ourselves and laughing about what we're doing. And when we exhibit this, actually, some people give us a comment of like, but why are you laughing? If like you're talking about like the serious and you're putting your bodies in as the painting, why you don't keep the straight face? And we were saying like, because that's what it's triggering you, because it's like a note of being like, that's not right, there's something off all about this. So that's our like way of getting in that sense of being like, of course there's something off. We're talking about the rape of the Sabine woman and us being named after like Sabina. So it's like, but it's like a really important tool to get to another type of public and to switch people to think, oh, right, why is it there? Or why are we framing it this way? And I think it opens possibilities, and that's what we wanted to use it as. And it's a different relation that for the public and for people, they get closer, creates a little bit more of community. It breaks this white wall idea of the art setting that you can't touch, that you can't laugh about, that you always have to be serious about it. And it's like, no, because when you're laughing and when you're sharing and talking in a more simple display without all these like grandiloquent words, then that's when real connections happen, and that's when community starts. So that's what we wanted to, and we use this as a tool to like give these points, but also questioning. And of course, sometimes humor is of like it might offend others, but it's like playing with this idea. Okay, what are we discussing about? So I think it's a great way of also asking and involving the audience in the way of why are you laughing at or thinking about it in different contexts.
Great. Thank you very much, Sabina. I'd like to move on to maybe honing down a little bit and focusing on the question of documentation for the Thinking Out Loud project. And I wondered, well, there's two ways we can go. I prepared a kind of presentation of what I've been thinking about in terms of documentation over the past couple of years in relationship to this project. But I don't want to show that as it might necessarily, as it might foreclose ideas and discussion. So I'm going to open it up to questions first, or comments about documentation. And if required, I'll make a presentation about what I've been thinking about, if that's interesting to people. Okay. Yes, Jordan.
Yeah, I had a question, I guess, and it ties back to the last presentation from Roshni around you had mentioned publishing and publishing about your methodologies and research, but you'd also briefly mentioned a portfolio project, and I only caught part of that comment. What was that initiative? And it sounded like it was with other artists, researchers in the UK, maybe, or internationally.
Yeah, I wasn't very clear about it, but thanks for the question. What we have, like you, we have within the university system a research framework that we have to submit our research projects and our research, uncover our research to it, and then we're judged against other universities. So one of the things that Westminster did with the REF, as we call it, in 2008, I believe, was to actually print and publish each artist stroke academic a portfolio of their work. And in that was, their research projects that were identified. It was identifying the kind of core questions to those projects, and then uncovering it through illustration, how the design of the project, the kind of rationale for the decision-making process of the piece itself. So the portfolio becomes this kind of very interesting, beautifully made, printed booklet, if you like, that actually is uncovering each project in detail. And so work in progress for me, and this is one of the things that we do with the AV, with the PhD students as well, because we have practice-based PhDs in the UK, is to understand a work in progress. How does somebody exhibit and give depth to the research process that underpins a piece of work? And there's been a lot of debate about that in the UK about, looking at a piece of work and saying that you can't necessarily understand the depth of research simply from that piece of work. So therefore, there has to be a way that is uncovered. So that's what I meant by portfolio booklets, if you like, that were produced around each academic stroke researcher stroke artist who was submitting to the research framework. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up, I guess. Are those available? Do artists such as yourself circulate those like through your website, or is it sort of through archives?
They're in the university. They're as part of the archive of the university. I could get the PDF and can share that with people in the future. I mean, that's very possible to do that. But they were submitted nationally to the advisory groups that were looking at them, and then they become an integral part of the archive for the institution itself. I do refer to it, and it's an interesting exercise, because as an artist, to do that, you start going back into your own archive in order to uncover the kind of the seminal practice, the processes and elements that make up that process. So for me, there is something really interesting about revealing the revelation of that process that becomes research, right? And that's really, really quite key. And that's something we expect of the PhD students as well.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roshini and Jordan. What I've decided to do now is just run through a very quick presentation about the range of things that I've been thinking about that impact the nature of documentation that affects a wide-ranging research project like Thinking Aloud. None of this is meant to preclude new ideas or better ideas. This is just stating some of the issues surrounding context. So it's more or less observations that I have. So the kind of materials I've been thinking about, well, there are two kinds that come out of a project like this. One is documentary, and there's a whole bunch of different things that you can produce: publications, podcast events, film, video, performances, theatre. There's documentary, and then there's creative interpretive, which is one of the drivers of this particular project, where you take issues, content, concerns, politics, social practice, and you place those ideas under the lens of a creative interpretive practice, of an aesthetic productive practice, and you produce other kinds of knowledge that is quite different to the documentary knowledge. So the second thing I've been thinking about is, well, what are the impacts of this particular research project? Knowledge contribution, obviously everything that we do which has serious intent and support and context contributes to knowledge. So we have a fabulously diverse, rich, impossible to archive almost collection of knowledge. So what I'm interested in is what is the future research that might come out of this project? We have this body of research which we can present, but what's future? What are the next steps? What are future projects? What are future actions? What are future politics? So I'm really interested in the impacts of drawing aloud. Then I was thinking about, well, in terms of documentation, what's our audience reach? Obviously, we're sitting in a university, Concordia University, where flooded, probably half the people in here are academics, maybe more. If not, they're researchers, if not, they're artist researchers, if not, they're activists, they're creatives in some way. So academia has a kind of shadow on this project, not a bad shadow, but a definite shadow. So we can publish an academic journal or a document, that'd be nice. But maybe we want to reach other people. Maybe we want to reach creatives, and creatives is kind of slash artists there. Engaged activists, engaged audience members, people who want to learn about this stuff, or maybe we want to reach the unengaged general public and just share information with them of the kinds of things that we've undertaken. So what are the actual effects or outcomes of this kind of project and the documentation associated with it? Well, I personally am interested in its generative capacity. What can be produced through this, and what kind of platform is it for next level activities? Not that this is a finished product, but it's part of a process which continues to go on, develop, expand, and enhance our understanding of the particular issues that we're engaged with. What's the utility that comes out of this? What are the actual ideas or tools for change? Academia, of which I've been part for a very long time, and the art world, of which I've been part for a very long time as well, is very good at ideation, very good at positing theoretical solutions, and very bad really at designing and implementing tools for change. So the question is, how do the ideas get into becoming tools and actually produce some kind of change and have an impact which impacts real life, not just the academic or artistic fields that we happen to work in? One of the most important effects or outcomes of the documentation is to preserve history, is to record the research in a way that continues to be accessible and doesn't become redundant. And the afterlife, where does it go after that? So I was thinking about forms of expression. Obviously, academic papers, to me, and I won't say this out loud, but they're boring. They get in the library, and people refer to them in their PhD and their MFA, and that's great. But they're kind of not that interesting, and they don't necessarily go directly from ideation into tools for change. So maybe there's other kinds of ways of thinking about what the documentation should be in terms of its expressivity. It could be a trace of the research. It can be an impression, a reflection. It can be observations. I'm big on observations. Observations are about looking at stuff and recognizing it. Maybe not understanding it fully, but seeing it and thinking about it. An observation is a wonderful tool that we have at our disposal within our own brain and eyes and ears. It could be a point of view. It could be a very specific argument. We just want to take the research and tease out one particular thing that's really useful and say, we're going to publish all about that because that's the thing that's really can move forward. Maybe it's an argument, maybe it's critical analysis, maybe we have some policy recommendations that we can make public. What kind of documentation constructs can we have? I was thinking, well, there's the conjunction. We have different disciplines. We have science, we have art, we have social science, which I regard as slightly different to science. We have environmentalism, which is part of science, etc. So a dialogue between disciplines. maybe just a compilation, not a dialogue, where you have a montage effect, you have lots of different content within those publications. Maybe it's a compound structure, like you get a really fantastic editor to pull it all together and make it into a curated, intensified, critical document that people say, wow, that was a fantastic publication. Maybe it's a complex, maybe it's competing discourses. Maybe we think about disagreements that take place. It seems to me a lot of people in this room agree about things, but maybe there's some theoretical or artistic or cultural disagreements that we can think about. So I was thinking about a research framework of inquiry. So what are the real questions that we're trying to answer? Can we articulate those? What's our case or argument? What have we discovered that we can make very clear? And what are the conclusions or the outcomes of the Thinking Aloud project? Can we state any conclusions, or is it an interregnum where we're just at a particular moment in time or in terms of the process of the discussion? And then there's importantly a note about editing. Editing, I'm a curator sort of by trade as well as an academic, and my role is primarily saying no to people as opposed to saying yes, let's do that. It's like, no, we're not going to do that. So it's a process of exclusion, but it's also about refining and clarifying things. And what you do include means that a lot of stuff is left out. So we need to be conscious of what we retain and preserve, but we also need to be conscious of what we discard, forget, omit. Things that we omit are frequently forgotten. And there are some things that we might discover in terms of our research that we want to conceal, that we don't want to say, that it's not the right time to say, or that we just don't want people to know that that was a big mistake and we should never have done that. The process of research is a process of trial and error, and a lot of discoveries have a 75% or even 90% error rate before they get to the 10% success rate that enables them to produce new knowledge of value to our society or our culture. And so the whole process of editing is absolutely critical to a project like this, which is so wide-ranging in terms of bringing a focus to it and bringing a sense of focus as it relates specifically to the kind of audience that we want to reach. Which particular audience are we trying to speak to? So I proposed to Leela and her group that we do something like a 3-part project. Because Leela and her team have suggested that we might publish some booklets, small booklets, that would become the documents, as it were, the historical record of this particular body of research. So part 1 would be evidence. What were all the material that we saw, the artist presentations, the research projects, elastic spaces, participants who've gone into the community in various ways and produced artwork or text or performance. So we have the evidence. Part 2 would be the results. How do we interpret that? How do we understand that? What do we make of that research? How do we bring together various documentary images? How do we creatively interpret that? That would be part 2. And then part 3 might be sort of post-activity interpretation. Making the observations concrete and articulating the insights that we can draw from this body of knowledge. So we have 3 parts designed to meet the audience that Leela and her team decide is the audience we want to reach, and try and address that. So part 1 would be the framework of the research project, the goals, the intentions, the hypothesis, the relevance. Part 2, the range of contents, the presentation, the data, what we actually did. And part 3 would be post-research phase, which would be the interpretation, analysis, conclusions, and outcomes, and maybe some positing for the future. Okay, what I'd like to do now is pass it over to you if you have any comments, questions, or proposals or thoughts or reactions to everything that we've heard today, both from the artists and here and Roshini, as well as kind of my framing of the discussion about documentation. So. Chantel.
I might switch from English to French because my French is my first language. But I just wanted to say that I really, I'm with you with the thinking about the documentation. And just before you started, I wrote in my little book, why about not seeing it as a documentation which convey a form of fixity and past, but instead as a living current part of the project. I just wanted to throw it out there and invite people to think through that lens. And I'm also like, I would be interested to see it as a creative interpretation more than as a like formal documentation.
Mm-hmm. So what was the first part of your question? Could you just repeat that?
Repeat what? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. What about not seeing it as a documentation which convey a form of fixity and past in a certain way, but as a living current part of the project?
Oh, right.
Yes.
So you would see it as not just a 3-part document, but maybe a 3-part first phase, then a 3-part second phase, and then so it would be a building process in terms of documentation as the research expanded and as the dialogue developed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all think that too.
Thanks.
Anyone else in the space or online?
This is partly the question. I mean, I think what you've proposed actually makes a huge amount of sense, because what it does is deal with framework, which I think we need to, a methodology. But there's also a 3-strand running through your 3 parts on the 3 themes. So I think there's a complexity still to how we address it. And I think Roshini's presentation was really fantastic in articulating the difference between the problematic of documenting something that's experiential, necessarily experiential and time specific when we encounter an artwork, when we present an artwork, and the difference between our research excellence framework in the UK, where we felt, and it's been part of, it's one of the best things that happened out of the research excellence framework, was that actually people articulated the methodology, context, and the way that work arises, but they're 2 very different things. And I think the richness of looking at the methodology and that framework of how things arise, so how you balance documentation in that framework, which we're all still struggling with if Roshini is still there on screen, because some people took, you know, across all the institutions in the UK, all the 80-something institutions with however many thousands of researchers, there were many solutions to that, as many solutions as individual artwork. So I think how we frame that and think about it, and of course documentation doesn't mean it's fixed on paper, it might be my prerogative, but it's certainly not the only way of documenting. So I think it is about how do we structure intent and process, and how do we then structure reflecting on, as well as documenting, creative practice, which I think has been very much at the heart of this whole project over the years. If that makes any sense, more of an observation.
Thank you.
Can I just contribute a little bit? Thanks very much. I mean, I agree with some of the contributions so far around the idea of creative interpretation, but I think I'd like to go back to thinking about who it's for. Because if I'm thinking about the portfolio and the ref, for example, that kind of went very much towards, it was within the institutional framing, it was actually to our peers, for example. I guess one of the things is, for me at the moment, is urgency. And Gary raised this issue of, how do we think about change, right? And that's what we need at this point in time, is thinking how our contributions, whatever we're making, thinking about, etc., actually is contributing to thinking about transformative processes. We can't exist in the space that we're in at this point in time because it's not working, right? So I guess one of the things that I would be interested in doing is really thinking about speaking to beyond the institution quite clearly, and thinking about beyond ourselves as artists, because we can always talk to ourselves as artists, and that's our peer group. We've always been doing it. It's about kind of trying to think about a creative and imaginative space that we are creating that is also just as invaluable as scientific discovery, right? So how, we have to have humor in our lives, as Sabina has pointed out, and we have to have the way in which language does or doesn't communicate, it seems to be. So people get a lot from the kind of artistic inquiry, and it seems to me that if we can kind of transmit that, important. So the only thing I would say about the three parts is they sound scientific. They sound as if, for me, they're kind of speaking a kind of a pseudo-scientific model space, right? And I would really go against that. I just think we have to use different terminology to think about. So we might be doing those things, but we might be using different terms to describe them. Because we don't want to mimic science, right? We're not about doing that. We're in an artistic and humanities space. And we're critiquing, all the time as well. So that, for me, is the other thing. And then the last thing, I was thinking about what Gary raised about the idea of contention and opposition and arguments. I am incredibly cynical around a lot of technology that's around at the moment. And equally so, I don't necessarily think that 3D in immersive space, etc., are going to kind of rectify or provide necessarily all positive things in that sense all the time for people. So for me, the connection to a 3D space and the connection to technology is something that none of us have really had a full discussion about, it seems to me, in this project. And we should really, we're not about technological determinism, are we? For me, that's a question, right? So I think, and of course the debate of AI now rears its head so fantastically. I'm working in Photoshop, it's intelligent now. Well, not intelligent, I don't think we should use that word, but there is calculations in the algorithm that are unprecedented. So I think there is something to be said around how and why and the limitations and advantages that we see for technology in relation to the specifics of social justice and migration. And technology don't go hand in hand at all. And the environment, right? And the environment maybe, So I would say that those are big issues to kind of put on the table and to raise our own thinking about them in relation to that.
I thoroughly agree about the pseudoscientific structure that I was proposing, and I wouldn't want to use that kind of language. I was thinking about that in terms of containers, of the way that we might structure the publications. But the publications, as I've always viewed them, we'll never have enough money to do them, but they always should be objects of desire within both a public framework and an academic framework, that people want to have these on their library shelves for research purposes, but they also want to own a copy because they're really extraordinarily stimulating records of this research as opposed to an essay, for instance. So yes, I completely agree. They should have a kind of an aesthetic dimension, which is palpable.
Hello. So I disagree with everything that's been said today. No, I'm only kidding. Only kidding.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone, for these great presentations. I was thinking of the context that we're in. You know, I think universities here in Canada, and I'm sure in the UK, are really training artists to be critical thinkers. But there's a bit of a gap between being a critical thinker and being an activist. And I'm wondering, should universities be training students to think in terms of activism, or is that something that's best done outside of academia? Thank you.
Now there's a contentious issue.
I'm a troublemaker.
My opinion, based on absolutely no data, is that universities have been training people to be activists for years, for decades, but to be activists of a particular kind, not the kind of activist you're suggesting, I think, which is interventionism or opposition or resistance, but an activism which is actually structurally and systemically oppressive. And I think that everybody who leaves a university with a degree, I have one, everybody in the room probably has one, has entered that training program. And we're all activists in our intellectual field. And many of those intellectual fields are quite oppressive. And being resistant to that is very difficult. So I think training people to be interventionist and resistant is going to be very difficult for universities based on their governance structures and their financial structures and their connection to their connection to political space. So yeah, it'd be nice to think that there would be pockets of resistance training going on, and maybe that's where the art school does come in. Anita's saying that it's true, but you know, I have my doubts. I see people wanting to enter, like, how can I get a gallery? You know, how can I sell art?
It looks like we have a question online from Rita. Would you like? Okay, so Rita asks, oh, Rita's here. Do you want to read out your question?
It's not so much a question as a comment, and with thanks to everybody who's spoken and presented. But I think whether we're activists or not, I think the work is to try to uphold the Indigenous laws and responsibilities that existed prior to colonization and continue to exist today. So I think reframing what we do as being in service of that connection to the land and the people of the land and the waters is something that we really need in a time of climate emergency. But not only because of that, but just because that's, you know, maybe important to ground ourselves in where we are and what we can give back and how to be in a reciprocal relationship with the places that sustain us and give us life. So, you know, on the West Coast where I'm zooming in from, our elders at the Tsleil-Waututh Nation have often said, we're not protesters, we're protectors. So like reframing it not as a reaction against all that's wrong, and there's so much to be in reaction against, but maybe trying to stay grounded in what we need to have a long-term view, as well as how to orient ourselves in the short term in terms of how to act. So I would be in favor of, you know, distributing all the generative work from this project in ways that speak beyond ourselves. And engage with people who I think are hungry for needing, you know, some grounding in what it means to kind of decolonize and remind ourselves that we're part of the earth. So not so much a question, but just a thank you and a kind of a hope for how we could maybe distribute this project.
Thanks, Rita. I agree.
So can I just raise something? I mean, just picking up on Rita's point, because I agree with everything she's saying about reframing. And picking up on the comment that was made about what universities are there to do. I don't know about you, but in the UK, our universities are rampant capitalist systems, right? They really are there to churn out people and make money from poor students in relation to the learning environment. It isn't doing anything else. So there is, and I would say that it is that there is a convergence, of course, there's always has been around the idea of our political, moral, and ethical profile and our work in that way, and how we go about teaching students to be morally and ethically responsible for what it is that they're doing, right? So teaching us to that code, and that universities have a responsibility to do that, it seems to me. So in answer to the previous question, the notion of activism, it will need to be embedded very much so in that process of reframing and transformative process that we need to be doing at this point in time. The only other thing I would say is that we've had these kind of waves of where art practice and art movements, and everybody in the room knows about this, which is where they have often mimicked and responded to a social emergency or a crisis of the time, right? So we think about the 30s, we think about, there's movements, artistic movements that we know about in art history that have actually responded at times more socially and more culturally to things and being attuned to that. And it seems to me that we're in that moment, and we're in that moment right now in a very fundamental and with a lot of crises around, which requires a reframing at a more fundamental level than I think ever before. And so I really welcome Rita's comments about the project really needing to think that through quite substantially.
And I would agree that we have complex structures for universities, but I think fundamentally, and within our education, they've always been about how do we transform lives, and actually how do we transform not just the participants in the education, but actually their social and moral compass. And maybe it's slightly different in Scotland. We still operate in the same structure for funding for universities and how they operate. But at the same time, it's very clear from the students that everything we're talking about in this project are day-to-day concerns for them, and they're facilitated to address that, whether it's different kinds of strategies through individual work, whether it's through design projects, but there certainly is a mode of activism. And we have in our own art school gallery a project called the Ignorant Art School, which I think is a 5-chapter, almost 5-year project working to think about how we reposition and reconsider the purpose and function of art schools. So it looks at all sorts of different models, and they're usually born out of a reaction to the status quo. So they're about refinding, just as the protests in Harrow for the UK audience in the 60s, but also the groups across Thailand, across all sorts of different parts of the world, coming together to find different modes of operation and different modes of functioning to deliver and share something that's through creative purpose, creative education, aligned to social and moral transformation. And I'm slightly jet lagged, so I haven't got all my references in hand.
I would like to ask, I'd not put you on the spot, Rita and Rashini, who I think make excellent points about the nature of the documentation and its leaning, how it should be framed, coming out of this particular colloquium. I'd like to ask you what you think might be a vehicle, a kind of vehicle that might assist that. What would it look like? How would it be structured, perhaps? If you don't have an answer, that's fine. Or if you have thoughts off the top of your head, that's fine. No one will hold it against you. But I wonder if you have specific thoughts about how those things might be implemented that we could think about.
Just briefly, I might say that there's so much material, it would be helpful to have it all in one place to sift through it, and then process it into kind of shorter forms or accessible forms. I'm not sure what that would necessarily look like, but I think starting with having it in one location, easily accessible, and knowing where to go through the materials, and then trying to figure out how and where it might be in service of things that are already going on, as well as things that need to be amplified, might be a way to start. I don't know if Rashini has thoughts, but that's kind of like, I don't want to comment on stuff that I haven't all looked through and read. But I'm sure there's a lot of material there that would be, could be of service, as well as, just intrinsically awesome.
Just off the top of my head, I think there's looking at the material, absolutely. I just wonder if we set a scene, right at the beginning, maybe at the end, so you top and tail in a way, in order to frame the way in which we might come at this material, right? So in the same way that I hear people talk about the land belonging to somebody else, that is, people start their conversations with that in Canada, as they should, right? But it seems to me, what does that mean? How might we unpack that, perhaps? How might we have a conversation about that? How might we kind of situate the material within that context, not necessarily only of Canada, but in relation to some of the kind of key moments that we're in around environmental challenges, etc. So to me, there are ways in which, in conversation, reframing material with a decolonial mindset becomes quite crucial. And that actually has to be learned. Everybody's kind of moving around it at the moment and doing their best, and the example given in Dundee is a case in point of where questions being asked around it. So for me, that's quite important. Again, I would also say, how is the technology limiting and framing and being an advantage to us making work, to us containing our bodies, to there is a whole area of technology in relation to migration, for example, and in relation to First Nation people around the incarceration and the containment of people, right? The embodied person. How do we reconcile that in relation to the work that we do? So for me, those kinds of questions become quite crucial to posit, not necessarily have answers for, but to posit right at the beginning in order to then look at the material. And that could also be done through archive historical material. It could also be, the response to that historical material. I'm thinking off the top of my head, as well as kind of futuristic. We could end with a kind of imagining kind of space of what does it mean if we had a different end game, right? If we had if colonization didn't happen, what would be happening, right? I'm kind of curious about that, you know, and I think other people can tell us what they might imagine it to be as well. So that one might be an end thing anyway.
That's awesome. Thank you, Rashini. I just to add on to that a little bit, as you were speaking, I wondered about, like, out of all of this material that's been generated, whether there's anything that might make a good booklet to send into prisons, for instance. Like, out of all of this work, what is relevant to somebody who's in the prison industrial complex, who should have had access to a lot of things they didn't have access to their whole lives? What is needed in that moment? And I speak as somebody who spent time in jail, walked into jail for blocking a pipeline, and basically finding my own book of poetry there waiting for me. And so prisons have libraries, and what kind of materials could go into prisons that would actually be empowering and supportive for the people who are in there, most of whom are there because of poverty, trauma, addiction, because of systemic violence, not necessarily through, you know, any kind of fault of their own. But yeah, it strikes me when we're thinking about publics and possible readerships that, you know, it can kind of dissolve into broadness. But if we think about specific communities who aren't well served enough by the arts and also by the education sector, like, I think prisons come to mind for sure. A lot of other places come to mind as well. Seniors' homes, another one, but yeah, I would be really interested in making a booklet specifically for distribution in prisons. It would be an interesting kind of test of what we do. How much of it actually is relevant to people in those situations? And my hope is that there would be quite a bit.
Can I ask you a question, Rita? How many people that you know of in prison read your book?
That's a great question. I don't think many people did, as far as I know, but it was still there. It was published in 98, I think. And when I arrived in 2018, 20 years later, the book was there. Nobody had ripped it up. Nobody had gotten rid of it. I don't know how many people read it. But as soon as people, fellow prisoners, found out that I had written the book, everybody wanted to read it. They were curious about that.
You should do a prison tour.
But I think the thing about the books in the prison is a lot of it is trash. A lot of it is junk. There's a lot of bad literature in prison. But there is, if you look hard, some good stuff in there. And I think there needs to be more meaningful material.
Thank you.
I can go. Okay. I just wanted to answer Rita's question. We do have a compilation of all the recordings. This is the third colloquium this year. So we had one in March with 2 panels, one in June with, I think, 6 panels, and this session in October with 3 days of panels. So those are available. And I think your point about other kind of publics to reach is really profound. It's very interesting and something I'd like to follow up on too. I have just a tangential comment from my colleagues in science, and it's that the pressure to publish is enormous, and to publish in the right journals, the ones that are respected. And as an artist, I feel an incredible privilege to be able to speculate and to open up spaces for inquiry and conversation that these colleagues have been kind enough to add to their workload. And they in turn have invited me to be part of their NSERC Natural Sciences and Engineering research. But I think if we want their continued presence, we have to be aware of the kind of pressures that they face, and that to find, just one of the reasons I love the term elastic spaces is elastic describes the way in which we need to be in order to add these questions to our conversations. And I noticed that you saw that Elder Bill in the audience, and he and Kathy would be, he's going to be giving a keynote tomorrow at the Montreal Botanical Gardens, where he'll be welcomed to this territory by a Mohawk elder. So we're really pleased with that. And those kinds of contributions are invaluable to how our conversations are taking place. So part of what we're doing is finding how to be elastic so that we can have these conversations. The documentation or publication is a sense of how to archive so that there's a trace of these activities. So far, we've been going since 2016, and a lot of the people are in the audience who have been part of that activity since 2016. And so it's taking place over time. And maybe we need to write a little bit about that too. And in addition, it's expanding its reach. So.
Can I just respond to Leila? There's something really interesting about what you said, Leila, about listening to the pressures that scientists have as well, which is really absolutely right. I just wonder, I mean, in the UK, I mean, and many will know that there is also the importance of the idea of translation of science into the public domain. That is also a pressure. And so I wonder, you know, if the kind of the space of the academic arts journal or the more experimental space of a publication that goes to a wider public might be attractive to a scientist, as well as obviously the pressure that they have ongoing in their own publications. So to turn that on its head and say, well, you know, we might be finding a more experimental space for you that becomes more kind of public orientated, that would be just as important for your kind of scientific, your thinking and your development of experiment. It's just a thought, really, that's perhaps how we could keep them attracted to the project and involved.
Yeah, hello. I'm not quite sure if I hear everything properly with my bad hearing in that. However, I think I can explain who I am and what I am in about 2 sentences, or maybe 3. I started off in Ferry Creek and hoping that I could get my people to come up from Port Renfrew, La Pachina to help. But I didn't get any except maybe 1 person. Now that was okay, but I wanted to carry on myself and my unknown mission that came together to me up at Ferry Creek, where I started realizing that I was influencing the colonists who came up to Ferry Creek, and that I was giving them a image of what they wanted in this life or in this world. And so I did I unconsciously stayed there and gave them feedback on what I was, but it didn't extend to my people. And but I wound up being a reflector of the hopes and dreams of about 10,000 or so young people. So I wound up sort of guilt-ridden in the fact that I have never been able to influence my people, because I firmly believe it's not my fault. It's not their fault. It's a system in this world that has people think in certain ways, and that thinking of those people in that sector, particularly on reservations, is limited and not liberated, whereas I was sort of liberated up at Ferry Creek, where about in February, the following February when we started, I didn't come together with a firm understanding of what my idea was of why and how we wound up at Ferry Creek. And it just came to me that, oh, I know what it is, but I'm still working on what it is. And it's to do with the humanity's economic system of exploit our Mother Earth, who we up at Ferry Creek were trying to protect. And so that probably spills the beans on what I was going to say tomorrow, is the fact that we have to create a re-indigenization process of this world where we can go back to our original selves, and I have to explain that in numerous pages, I suppose, but right now I'm in process of actually answering the young lady who is, I think, from Wet'suwet'en and is concerned about my activities. Well, I can say to her, I'm still in process. I'm still trying to reach out to people to start thinking. Weird, eh? Thanks.
What I'd like to do now is to invite any final comments or notes that people want to make. If there's nothing that people want to close with, I'd like to thank the presenters today, Roshini and Sabina, and I don't have the name in front of me. Sorry. Oh, hey Lynn. Yes, sorry. I need to have the name in front of me. Sorry. So I'd like to thank the three presenters today, and to everyone who participated and asked questions. And if you have any further comments or ideas that you'd like to submit, I'm sure you can submit them to the team. You're all aware of the team that works with Layla. And you can contact them at any time. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you so much once again to everyone for joining us for this conversation. We're going to go ahead and end the live stream now, but a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you would like to revisit it or share it. We're going to keep the Zoom going, so we encourage everyone here online and in the space to stick around